You never get over it. Grief is a lifelong journey, but when you're willing to enter that journey and acknowledge its place in your life, it stops becoming something that necessarily always fills the room. I'm just so grateful that I had the honour of carrying them for the time that I did, and that they changed my life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Guilbeault with Inspired. I'm really excited to be back with another fantastic guest. Basically, if you're new to us, Inspired is all about meeting a whole bunch of my mates and contacts from all sorts of different walks of life. And it involves stories, hearing how they've journeyed, how their faith has pulled them through sometimes. It's authentic sharing. It's the highs, the lows. And I've got no doubt you're going to be absolutely moved and inspired this week because we've got a fantastic guest called Zoe Clarke-Coates. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you very much. It's an honour to be on your podcast.
Oh, brilliant to have you. So Zoe and I were both at Spring Harvest a few months ago, and I've heard some of her story. Yeah, I mean, it touches me because I think as you hear her story, you'll either have experienced some of what she's been through, or you'll know someone who's close to you who's been through it as well, because she lost 5 babies and then basically was the founder of Mariposa Trust, which some might know under the emblem of saying goodbye, with her husband Andy, all the way doing this together. And it's a charity that's become one of the leading support charities, reaching over 50,000 people a week across the world. She's I suppose you're a grief expert. That's one of the things you'd say you were. She was appointed by the Secretary of State for Health to co-chair the National Review of Baby Loss across the NHS and the UK. She's written a whole bunch of books that have sold really well. She's got her own talk show called Soul Tears. She does loads of media stuff. And anyway, let's get into that. But the other day when we were talking, Zoe, you told me the incredible story right from your conception. It's been amazing, hasn't it? So kick us off with that.
Yeah. So people will often ask me when I became a Christian, and I always feel I need to start prior to that, because when I was growing safely tucked away in my mum's womb, things started to go wrong. And my mum and dad didn't really have a faith. My mum had grown up being taken to church for, the traditional occasions, Easter, Christmas and whatnot. My dad hadn't been raised in a faith background at all either. And it was during that pregnancy that things started to go wrong. So my mum had started experiencing problems and had gone to the hospital, and were quickly told to her that things had gone very wrong and she needed to abort me. And Mum just knew that wasn't something she could do, and she refused and said, I'm just not going to do it. And they said, well, to save your life, you need to abort, but your baby doesn't have any chance of survival. But Mum was really convinced that that was something she couldn't and wouldn't even entertain, and said, what other options are there? And the hospital told her, there's no other option. The only thing we can suggest you do is go to the church, because what you need is a miracle. And so Mum took that, okay, I'll take that information. And that's exactly what she did. And she went to the church where she was always taken at Christmas, Easter, etc. And the vicar there was called Father Parker. And she went to him and said, this is what the hospital have told me. And he said, okay, let's pray. And he prayed over her bump and prayed that I would survive. And things throughout that pregnancy would often quickly change. And Mom would say that she would go into the bathroom and would start bleeding. But within hours, there'd be a knock on the front door, and Father Parker would be standing there and say, I've been sent by God to pray for you.
Amen.
And he'd lay hands on her again and pray. And I was obviously kept safe and sound in there because I was delivered safely. And the hospital said I was a miracle child. I just shouldn't have survived, but I did. So obviously that made Mom aware that there was something bigger out there. This wasn't just something that, that you can just call upon when you need it. There was actually a God there. There was realness behind all of these prayers, but she still didn't become what you'd now know as a born-again Christian. And she said her next real encounter was she went to christen me, and she heard from God that she shouldn't christen me, that she had to just dedicate me back to God. And so she said to Father Parker, I know what you normally do in the church is christen, but I just don't feel that's right. I really feel I've heard from God, and what I'm meant to be doing is dedicating her, not christening her. And they said, okay, we'll do that. And through all of that, I guess Mum knew that there was a God. She'd heard God's voice, but she still hadn't made that commitment. And it wasn't until I was about 5 years old, she said, that she was led by some family members to Christ, Mom and Dad together. And apparently, I don't even remember this at all, but they were sitting in the lounge reading the Bible. They'd just become Christians, and they didn't understand what they were reading. But apparently I just got up and ran out the room sobbing and crying. And Mom ran after me and went to the bedroom and found me there. And she said, what's the matter? Why are you crying? And apparently I then explained exactly what they were confused about in the Bible and gave them real insight into it, which just blew them away. And at that point I said, I want to be a Christian too, and gave my life to Christ. Wow. So that's my journey to becoming a Christian, even though I don't really remember it.
Yeah, extraordinary. Father Parker, what a legend.
Absolutely.
But also Zoe, your name, correct me if I'm wrong here. I mean, again, your father wasn't yet a follower of Jesus, but it was almost like Zechariah style in the Bible. You were going to have another name, and he said, no, her name's going to be Zoe. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was meant to be called Christian, which is a funny name for a girl. But apparently that was going to be my name, whether I was a boy or a girl. And he just knew I had to be called Zoe. And they didn't know the significance of that. But now we all know that the meaning of the name Zoe is life. And that's exactly what was spoken over me. And then became my call, really, to speak life into situations and help people refine their life after they've lost it through loss.
Yeah, amazing. So from sort of the age of 5 or 6, that's when your parents meet Jesus, you meet Jesus. Mm-hmm. Does that make it for a smooth teenage journey? And do you carry on being able to exposit the Bible for elders like you're doing at that point?
I don't, and didn't. I think that was a one-off. Teenage years weren't easy. They were hard, but I kept my faith through everything that I journeyed. And there was I think a period of time around 17 where I went through that natural questioning, is my faith still my own, or is my faith what it is just because I've got parents who are passionate Christians? Mm-hmm. But I could never turn around and say I didn't believe in Jesus. And even in my questioning years or months, I always prayed. I could never deny what I'd personally known, and always felt that touch of heavenly blessing on my life, in the fact that things weren't easy, but I always felt God was journeying with me. And so absolutely, I hung on to my faith all the way through my teenage years, apart from those months or maybe a year of questioning. But I think that was kind of important because I needed to know that my faith was truly mine and went really deep.
Mm. And then quite early, husband Andy comes on the scene. You have a few decades, don't you, of business and charity sector experience. How much do you want to share on that one?
Yeah, so me and Andy met when we were around 18, we met. And we're friends for a few years, and went on a drink one night. That was definitely not a date. It was just a friend thing. And I remember looking at him and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to marry you. Mm. And he said he had exactly the same, where he was all for it. I was absolutely commitment phobic and ran in the opposite direction. I was like, no, I can't do this. But we ended up saying that night, let's start dating. And every night, actually, we'd go out, we'd see each other every day. And every evening it would end with me saying, I'm really sorry, I just can't do this anymore. I'm just not the relationship type like this. I just need to end it. And he'd go, okay, see you tomorrow. And the next day he would just turn up again. Brilliant. And this went on for a few weeks. And I remember holding a dinner party and inviting him. And across that dinner, I remember thinking, I'm falling in love with you, and being really scared about it. And I still never said it. And 6 weeks later, we were out one afternoon and he said, what would you say if I asked you to marry me?
Wow.
And I said, I'd say absolutely no way. Why would you ever ask me that? And he went, oh, okay. And that night we went out for dinner, and over dinner he said, Zoe, would you? And I just burst out laughing. I said, just stop right there. You are not continuing that question. And we just carried on dinner like nothing had even happened. And then the next course came and he did exactly the same. And then by dessert, he said, I'm going to try and ask you this for one final time this evening. And he just said it really fast. And he said, Zoe Clark, will you marry me? And I turned to him and I said, Andy, I've not even told you I love you yet. Why are you asking me this? And he said, because I love you enough to never need to hear you say it back to me.
Wow.
And
Andy.
I said, oh my goodness, that's the sort of love I need in my life. And absolutely, I love you too. And I will marry you. Yeah. So within 6 weeks, we were engaged. And 6 months later, we walked down the aisle and got married.
Wow, great story. Hi folks, most of you know this podcast comes out under the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, which works in Burundi, according to IMF figures recently, still the hungriest and poorest country in the world. Now, we do lots of beautiful things. I love the story recently of a leader who resisted going into prostitution and had a pair of scissors, did some hairdressing, could hardly make ends meet, but with a £7 loan, that was like $8.50, she was able to buy a few hair products, which enabled her to just get a higher margin on her hairdressing. And she has now paid back that loan. She managed to buy a pig, and more recently, on the back of paying back the loan, we've given her a bigger loan, and she's rented premises as a proper hair salon. I love that. £7 stopped her going to prostitution. The whole community now honours her as a woman of stature for not having gone down that path. £7, $8.50, literal game changer. We got lots of those stories. If you wanted to support our work out there, if you're loving the podcast, as many of you are, then you could just give whatever a month. It'd be beautiful. That's greatlakesOutreach.org/inspired. greatlakesOutreach.org/inspired. Any sum would be beautiful. Anyway, let's get back to the podcast. So you get married, you often think it's all going to be sweetness and light, don't you, at the start? And clearly you've had a bumpy, challenging road. But I think the first number of years, you delayed trying to have kids for over a decade, didn't you? Those were busy, frenetic, business, career-orientated years, were they?
They were, but we were and are soulmates and absolutely loved just being together. And anything that we did together was joy-filled. And I think that helped make the decision to wait to try for children, because we just loved being with one another and felt really complete as a family unit. Started a company that was really successful, an international events PR marketing company. Our clients were people like Bupa, Coca-Cola, etc. And we were running events and project management for them. And we're just loving life, traveling the world, doing lots of international work. And so that's part of why we delayed having children, because one, we presumed having children would just be easy and we wouldn't have any issues at all. But also because we were just living life so much together. And I always thought that biological clock was a myth, that you can start to hear this ticking clock. But actually, I can absolutely state it's true, because overnight, I suddenly had this overwhelming desire that we needed to have children, and shared it with Andy, and he felt exactly the same. But we'd been married for over 10 years by that point. And just said, well, this is how I'm feeling. What do you feel? And he said he felt the same. So we decided to try to have children. And as I said, I think we just believed it would be easy and we wouldn't have a problem. To go a bit back on that, I'd actually trained as a counsellor before ever going into the corporate world. My mum's a therapist, and I'd grown up with the language surrounding psychotherapy, etc., was just commonplace at home. And so it felt like a natural thing for me to train in. So after school, etc., that's what I went in and trained in. And so never intending to really use it professionally, but wanting to have those skills under my hat, so to speak. And actually, I used all those skills in business all of the time. So it was really effective. But that's kind of an important piece to this puzzle. Went into the corporate world, loved doing what we were doing, decided to have children. And that's kind of where our loss journey began, because it didn't just happen easily. We tragically lost our first baby. And we really believed that was a one-off, and we didn't really discuss it openly. We didn't tell people what we'd gone through. We decided to very much deal with it privately, didn't discuss it. I kind of refused to be one of those statistics. And I felt like by not publicly talking about it or acknowledging it meant we wouldn't be one of the many, when we quickly learned that sadly 1 in 4 people lose a baby. And I just felt like if we didn't acknowledge it, that we wouldn't be part of that statistic. And ironically, being a grief specialist, which I was, I knew the process of loss and grief, and I knew talking about it was actually the really helpful and wise thing to do, but chose to do the opposite. And we just decided to try again. And this pregnancy, we were really blessed to get pregnant. I was in bed one evening and I heard a voice in my ear saying, get out of bed and do a pregnancy test, you're pregnant. And I was like, no way, is that true? And decided to be obedient, get out of bed, do a pregnancy test. And I was pregnant, and I just couldn't believe it. It felt, I don't know, after losing the first baby, it felt really miraculous and really different, actually. I think because of really hearing from God that I was pregnant, it felt different. And the pregnancy felt kind of different as well. And everything was going along perfectly. I'd been for scans, seen our daughter growing, everything was. And then on one Friday afternoon, I suddenly started to bleed, but it was only slight. And I'd actually been warned that that might happen on one of my scans, because they'd said that they could see a bit of blood in my womb. And so if I ever did bleed, to not overly panic. And even hearing that, you still panic. Anybody who's pregnant will tell you the sight of blood just is really horrific. It's really terrifying. And even having that warning didn't help. So we managed to find a clinic who could scan me within a few hours, which was really great. And we darted over to that clinic and kind of sitting in the waiting room in pretty much silence, thinking, is our world about to change again? But it didn't. We went in for the scan and there was our daughter waving happily on the screen, and everything was brilliant. And it was really reassuring. But if you ever have a bleeding pregnancy, they don't ever tell you to just go away and everything's perfect. They tell you everything's great now. That doesn't mean everything will be okay tomorrow. But you hear that all of the time. And so part of your brain is totally hopeful and positive. But then the other half is thinking, oh, I hope things don't suddenly go a different direction. But we were reassured enough. And the next day, all the bleeding had stopped, and we were running this big event actually on an evening for all of our friends and neighbours, etc., because it was coming up to Christmas. And suddenly I had this massive bleed. And I remember being in the bathroom, just rocking on the bathroom floor, really having a sense that our daughter had just died, and begging God to save her, and just praying over my stomach and reminding God that he'd told me she was there. And that's how I discovered I was pregnant, and praying for a miracle that all would be well. And we ended up going to the hospital that night, and we were met with really poor care and really uncompassionate staff. It wasn't even busy. It was so quiet. I think there may have been one other person in A&E. But they were just really dismissive. They said, well, I was still pregnant. Of course, I was still pregnant. Why would anything have changed? I'd had a scan the day before. Why would anything be different today? And to just ignore the bleeding. And they booked me in for a scan a week later. And I just knew I couldn't wait that long. We went home. That was a Saturday. The Sunday the bleeding had virtually stopped. And I started to feel a bit more hopeful, even though I'd had this overriding sense that she had died. We started leaving messages on private clinics, answer machines, just begging for them to see me on Monday morning. And Monday morning came about and our phone rang really early saying, we've got a scanning appointment available. If you can just get over to the clinic immediately, we'll scan you. So we kind of leapt in the car, drove over to this clinic. And as soon as we went into the room, it felt really different because it was a really upmarket private scanning clinic. So instead of just having a little screen, there was a massive screen opposite on the wall. And the midwife started scanning me and instantly we could see our daughter on the screen. So we just issued like this massive sigh of relief, both of me and Andy. She was really still, but as babies are when they're asleep anyway. But the midwife didn't really speak at all. And eventually she just said, I'm really, really sorry. But her heart stopped beating. And the bottom just opened in our world. And I felt like we were just falling through a trap door. And it felt really surreal. It felt like a real out-of-body experience. I remember screaming and crying. And we were quickly put into another room where we were away from all of the patients to kind of absorb the news. And I remember phoning my mum and dad, who were just beside themselves, and said they would leap in the car. They live in Devon and would get to where we were as quickly as they could. And I begged for another scan, and I was given another scan. A consultant then came and did the scan and said, I'm really sorry. The first scan was correct. She has died, and we don't know why, and probably won't ever know why. And didn't give us much information, really. We were told we could deliver her naturally or we could go down the medical route. And the thought of just going to a hospital to deliver her felt really wrong. And so we decided to go home and just wait for things to start naturally. And it actually took a week before I went into labour. And that week was so dark and so hopeless and so terrifying. And I would spend hours just sobbing hysterically and then would just feel numb. And I remember looking out of our kitchen window, seeing all these Christmas lights twinkling around all the neighbourhood and around all our neighbours' houses. And that feeling like such a hopeful and beautiful thing. But yet here we were in this desolate valley of hopelessness. But that whole week, I just kept praying over my stomach that she'd come back to life. And we'd go for another scan, which we needed to do a few days later, which is standard practice. And they would tell me the good news. So until we'd gone for that, I was still in a 95% absolute devastation and 5% really believing that a miracle could happen. And it didn't happen. Yeah, a week to the day, we delivered her. And it was terrifying. I'd like to say it was beautiful. Some people's stories do have an amount of real beauty and a cherished time when you're getting to deliver your child. But for me, there was none of that. I felt really robbed of a promise and just so broken. And I honestly didn't know if I'd ever recover. And in those weeks after, we kind of retreated into a bubble. We felt like we didn't want to make other people sad and share our pain. It's really interesting, actually, when you go through baby loss, that you start to feel responsible for other people's pain. The fact that they wouldn't be experiencing this heartache if you hadn't tried for a child and then lost a child. So you kind of feel responsible for their pain. So even seeing their pain is so agonizing because you want to rescue them from it and you feel like you've caused it. And it was really horrible. I remember phoning the family and saying, we decided we won't come to Devon for Christmas. We're just going to be on our own. And the family going, no, absolutely not. And we went, but we're going to ruin all of your Christmases. How can we come? And they were like, no, you come. And we'll just all sit and weep.
Yeah.
And it was such a beautiful thing. And it was just a real permission to show up. And we didn't have to show up fake.
Yeah.
We could just show up and be real. It was really beautiful. It was actually in those weeks surrounding Christmas, because I remember we were driving back from Devon and we were sitting in the car and I was listening to a song on the stereo, which was Tim Hughes' song, When the Tears Fall. And I remember in those moments feeling like I'd left my body and had almost been taken into heaven. And I remember feeling so connected with heaven and Jesus. It was one of the most beautiful heavenly moments I've ever experienced, where I remember thinking in that moment, I wouldn't change anything I've gone through for those seconds of encounter. It's so hard to explain, but it was so surreal and so beautiful. And I remember thinking, everything I've gone through has given me this access to something so far removed from me.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking I wouldn't change anything I've gone through because that moment was so utterly beautiful. And I share that because it was so special, but also it didn't stay. I remember hours later thinking, I can't believe I've gone through this. And if only we'd got a different outcome. So it didn't remain that feeling. But I remember in that moment feeling so connected to heaven. It was utterly beautiful. And knowing that's what the Bible means by his closest to those who mourn and grieve, because it really did feel like I'd been given this access to a heavenly encounter that I'd have never, ever been given if I hadn't gone through the loss that I had. So a while after that, we decided to try again and tragically then lost that third baby. And after that, I didn't know whether I'd have the strength to carry on trying. We'd actually got a dog, and our dog was just so part of our family. And we'd had to stop international travel with work because of him, because he'd had a bit of ill health and we couldn't leave him with people anymore. So our world had really altered because of him. And we couldn't ever be out the house for more than so many hours. And overnight, he became really ill, and we'd taken him to a vet and then said that they didn't think it was hopeful. And then we'd taken him to our own vet because we'd been away at the time. And our vet said, no, he's all good. Everything's fine, which was great. Probably 3 hours later, he had this episode where we thought he was dying. And I remember phoning our vet, who was a friend, and he said, just bring him straight into me. I can't believe anything will have changed that quickly. I saw him this morning, but bring him straight in. And we did. And as soon as we got into the veterinary surgery and carried him into the veterinary clinic room, our friend and vet started screaming at us, tell me to put him to sleep because he's going to have a heart attack in front of you. And obviously we said, put him to sleep, because we couldn't bear for him to suffer. But I remember walking out thinking, we've now lost everything. We've lost our 3 children. We've lost our dog. And we'd got each other, which was obviously most important. But we felt stripped bare. We felt like vacant and terrified of the future. And the next morning, we didn't know what to do that night, but the next morning we got in the car and we started to drive, and we drove to the top of Scotland. just crying all the way. And when we got to the top of Scotland, Andy went, "Where do we go now?" And I said, "I don't know. Let's go home because the vet will be ringing to say to collect his ashes." So we turned around and drove the long journey home. And we didn't really eat or drink during that whole trip. We were just truly bereft, and we were grieving for 3 children. We were grieving for our dog. We were grieving for the life that we thought we were going to have, but now seemed completely removed from us and almost not possible. Because I remember saying, I just don't have the strength to face more loss, so I just don't think we can ever try again. And Andy was so amazing and was like, "Whatever you want. If you want to try again, we'll try again. If you don't want to try again, we just won't." We were enough for each other, and that's what we kept reassuring each other and saying, there is no pressure. If this is where our journey stops in trying to have an earthly child, that's where our journey stops. But once we got home, within weeks, I started to experience really weird symptoms and eventually thought, I wonder if I should just do a pregnancy test. And did do one and could not believe I was pregnant. And then we were terrified because I hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk for weeks by this point, hardly at all. We were so broken. And I remember going to see our consultant and he said, "Don't panic. If a baby is meant to survive, it will survive. You won't have done any harm. Don't worry. The baby will have taken all of its reserves from you." And we'd made a decision not to try again, but here I was pregnant. And it felt like that decision had been taken away from us. And I was so grateful for that because it was the choice of the decision that was so hard. It felt like we needed to be ready to face more loss and more pain. And I didn't think I could ever choose that.
Yeah.
And it felt like that choice had been taken out of our hands. And I was just so eternally grateful for that he knew I couldn't make that decision. So he made it for me. That was the first baby we got to bring home from the hospital. That's our daughter, Esme. Amelia Promise is her name.
Amen.
And she really, truly was our miracle. She was the gift of all gifts. And she brought us so much joy. She still brings us so much joy, obviously. But we thought we'd only have one child, and we quickly decided to have more, which was such a shock to the whole family because they really believed we would stop at one, especially given our previous experience. But we decided to try again and were really delighted to find out we were expecting again when Esme was around 2. And again, all our scans were going beautifully and we were watching our little boy Samuel grow. And on one afternoon, we were all there as a family. Esme was sitting there and we were with the consultant, our friend Chris, and he was scanning me and he just stopped speaking. And he said, "I don't even know how to tell you, but his heart has stopped beating." And yet again, the trapdoor opened and we fell, but this time we'd got our little 2-year-old staring at us going, "Mummy, is everything okay?" And I just asked to leave the room for a moment. And I remember going into the bathrooms and just screaming and sliding down the walls going, "God, no. How are we meant to walk this path yet again? How can I literally have 4 heavenly children and only 1 earthly child? How can this be really our story? Can this really be what we're asked to walk through?" And it felt, again, all the same things, terrifying, scary. It did feel different. This time we weren't grieving the fact that we'd probably never raise a child. But this time we were so acutely aware of what we'd already got with Esme and so what we were losing with Samuel, that we could imagine her sitting with him. She knew we were pregnant. She knew she was having a sibling and we were going to have to tell her that he died and explain that to a 2-year-old. And yeah, it was horrible. And this was the first time I decided to go down the medical route to deliver him. I felt like I couldn't just wait for things to happen naturally. That wouldn't be fair to her. And often you can go down the natural route and still end up in hospital anyway. And so I wanted, for her sake, to not do that. So I went into surgery and he was born. And yeah, it felt, again, really hopeless. I remember sitting in the bedroom with my sister. Andy was playing with Esme in the other room, and we were trying to keep life as normal as possible for her, and so trying to really grieve separately from her. And I remember my sister going, "Are you okay?" and me saying, I'm literally drowning. And I couldn't get my breath. I literally couldn't even take a breath of air because the pain was so bad. And all I could say is, "I'm drowning," and she just didn't know how to help me. And it was so hard. And I remember feeling so bad for her because she so wanted to rescue me and she knew she couldn't. And I think we often underestimate the role of the supporter and the hand holder, but actually it's a really hard path to walk, to be able to sit often in silence because there's no right words to say, and watch someone experience that depth of pain. And so I really appreciated her showing up and being willing to sit in like a vigil, really, with us as we grieved. And as she came to the hospital with us and was with Esme as I was taken into theatre. And that really helped. But the time after was hard. We journeyed through the grieving process and eventually decided we would try again. And we're really blessed yet again to discover we were pregnant. And we decided to surprise everybody at a Christmas Eve party that we were expecting. And we broke the news to the family and they were obviously overjoyed. And I then said, "Hang on, I'm just going to nip to the loo at the party." And in that loo visit, I found I was bleeding. And we were quickly informed that, yet again, we'd gone through loss. So that Christmas, we were grieving and yet again. And it wasn't until in the January that I started to get sicker and sicker. And eventually I said to Andy, let's just book a private consultation with a specialist because something's seriously wrong with me. I mean, I could hardly speak. I was so sick. And it was during that appointment we found out that the doctors had made a mistake and I hadn't lost that baby at all. I was actually pregnant. And we quickly then found out that we were actually expecting twins. So we went from bereft to experiencing this miracle that there was two babies, that we'd been grieving for a child that had never been lost. But I carried on getting sicker and sicker, and something had really gone wrong inside of me, and they didn't know if I would survive. And tragically, we lost one of the twins, and I then had to go on to have 2 surgeries within a week. And during that time, they said there was going to be nothing they could do to protect the baby. But if I didn't have the surgery, I would die. So, of course, she would also die. And so I had no choice at all but to go for the surgery. And we both pulled through. We both made it through the surgery, which was amazing. But we quickly got told within a couple of weeks, I carried on getting sicker and sicker, and it didn't make any sense because the surgery was meant to have corrected what was wrong. And we were booked in for an emergency scan, and we were told that something really rare had happened. And just prior to the surgery, a stone had left my gallbladder, which had then been removed. But it had gone into a bile duct and actually got blocked. And because the gallbladder had then been removed, we were now in a really, really life-threatening situation because there was no way of going in to retrieve it because obviously I was expecting, I was carrying our daughter, and the only way they'd be able to go in was via my spine, and it would need to be done under X-ray conditions, and they'd need government permission to do that operation because of the radiation. And they basically refused to do it and said it was too dangerous. And again, me and Andy, I remember sitting on a bed, both of us sobbing. My mum and dad were playing with Esme in another room, and us saying, so this is it. I'm now going to die, and our daughter would die in me, and we're going to leave our little girl without a mum. And it felt, again, hopeless. And Andy decided he was going to beg the consultant, which he did. He got on the phone and he said, you've got to do this surgery. You have got to save my wife. Imagine if this was your wife. And would you not want someone to try and save her? And by the end of the phone call, the consultant had agreed to do the operation and said, I'll do it. He said, we'll need to get all the permissions in place, but I know I'll be able to approve that. But before that happens, I'm going to need to order an urgent MRI. So I know exactly where everything is. So when I go in, I know exactly where to head so it can be as safe as possible. And we'd already got the scan, obviously showing where it was, but he wanted this MRI done. So we saw this as a real window of opportunity, and my mom started to gather people to pray, and all prayer networks she knew, she contacted and phoned and said, my daughter needs a miracle. We've got 24 hours, and this is about saving her life and the baby's life. We need churches to start praying. And people were quickly rallied and started to pray. And the scan was arranged for, I think it was like 8 a.m. the following morning. So we'd got one evening for the miracle to take place in. And so all night we were praying and trusting God and calling out for this miracle. The scan happened, and we got then home after the scan, and the consultant phoned me from the hospital and said, we have no clue what happened, but some sort of miracle has happened because the stone has just vanished. And there's nothing in the bile duct anymore. And it was too big to pass through the duct. There was no way of that happening. We could see from the first scan, but it's just vanished. No surgery is needed. And what a miracle that was. And the rest of the pregnancy wasn't easy, but it was miraculous, and every bad bit of news we got was countered with some quickly good news after that. And eventually she was born following a whole other emergency where I had to be rushed into theatre and to save again my life and her life. But she was born healthily and well. And that's how we got our 2 earthly children and 5 heavenly children.
Wow. So I'm pretty exhausted listening to you, and I really appreciate this. I know there's a real cost, emotional cost in sharing that story. So thank you for the gift of your vulnerability and openness with us, truly. So I don't want to be glib. Sometimes people can misquote Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So your own personal tragedy was awful. You dug deep, you pressed into your faith, but there's beautiful good that has come out of that, hasn't there? Including, obviously, setting up Mariposa Trust. Do you want to talk about that chapter?
Yeah, well, just to touch on the first part of what you just stated, I think often as Christians, when you go through a journey like we did, people are quick to say, well, God wouldn't have allowed you to go through it if you weren't strong enough. And, well, this is clearly all part of God's plan. And that actually caused me significant pain through the walk, because I also knew that wasn't true. God didn't cause our losses. That wasn't in any way part of his plan. We are not created as parents to bury our children. That all happens because of the fall. That's when sickness and illness came in. This wasn't God's ultimate plan for my life, that I would be really broken. I would then turn it to glorify God in some way. But what I did know to be true was God was grieving with me. And all of those times where I felt so alone, the one thing I never doubted was the fact that God knew exactly what I was going through. the ultimate sacrifice for him was to give his son, which showed me he knew the most awfulest of pains was coming from losing a child. And so all through my experience, I just knew no one got it other than him ultimately, because there was no question that he knew the significance of the loss of a child. And so I knew it wasn't part of his plan, but I knew he would use it. But I also knew the kindness of God, the fact that he wasn't going to say, right, you've journeyed through all this pain, now you've got to use it for a greater good. It's always a choice. And he's a gentle and kind father. And if I hadn't ever wanted to use any of the pain I'd gone through to help others or to glorify him, that was absolutely fine. He would totally get that and would be totally fine with that. However, I was also aware of the scriptures that he can turn things for good and he can bring beautiful things out of ashes. And for me, I really felt I needed that it was a natural part of my story. And once I'd got Bronte, our daughter, safely in my arms after delivering her, I started to really hold on to God's coattails and saying, okay, how is this going to be used? There's no way I've gone through all of this without it being used for the good. And this is where all of my past pieces of the jigsaw suddenly started to make sense, that I was a trained counsellor, a trained grief specialist, but I'd got all this business experience and work on a governmental and business and professional level. And I'd got all of these skills and then all of this personal experience too. And while I was questioning God, I started to have a real sense of all of my past is going to start to make sense in how it's going to be used. And I remember saying, but how? What do I need to start? What do we need to do? And just feeling this real call to start some saying goodbye services. And initially they weren't called that. They were called Born into Heaven services. But we quickly changed that because we realised that what we needed to do was secular. That was something we were definitely being called to launch, not something just for those of faith. That we wanted to be that bridge for people who have got a faith but have not got a faith, for those who blame God and for those who don't even believe there is a God, that we needed to be closest to the brokenhearted, where we could turn to God in our darkest hours. What about the people who don't have that? How do they survive those dark night of the soul moments? And realising that we could start this and we'd got all of the skills to do it because of the event experience and PR experience, but then all the counselling experience too. So we decided to launch a set of saying goodbye remembrance services, and we decided to hold them at cathedrals because these are beautiful historic venues that people of faith or no faith are happy to go into because they're used for public ceremonial events, royal events. And we felt that that would really showcase to the world that baby loss doesn't need to be a hidden thing, and that these babies deserve to be honoured and remembered. The Guardian newspaper said they would love to do an article on us crossing over from the business world into doing something charitable. And that made things really explode for us. And BBC pledged to support us in what we were doing and asked if they could record the first saying goodbye service for Women's Hour. And we agreed. And it became overnight this really big organisation that at the time was just run as a not-for-profit division of our company, but we quickly saw that we needed to make it a standalone charity, and the company needed to just service the charity rather than it staying as just a division of the organisation, because we could see what it was really becoming. And within months, our website was having over 650,000 hits a month. And we realised what we'd launched was something that was so needed, that there were so many people who were crying alone in their bathrooms and didn't know where to turn and didn't know if it was okay to speak about this pain of loss. And suddenly we were giving people permission to talk. And it really quickly escalated and has become what it is today an organisation with many different divisions, all now under the umbrella of the Mariposa Trust, which means butterfly in Spanish, which symbolises new life and new hope. And the acknowledgement of grief and loss and the power of acknowledging the pain and processing the grief. You never get over it. Grief is a lifelong journey, but when you're willing to enter that journey and acknowledge its place in your life, it stops becoming something that always fills the room. Yeah. I always say the fact that initially when you go through loss, it's like you've got this square box and the pain of the grief fills that room. But over time, your grief muscles just get stronger and stronger, and that expands the room. Yeah. So the loss never gets less. The grief doesn't get less. It's still just as significant, but you grow that room. So eventually, you just are okay with carrying that. And now I so rarely cry about the babies I've lost. I'm just so grateful that I had the honour of carrying them for the time that I did, and that they changed my life. I honestly feel like I used to see the world in black and white, and now I see it in full colour. They expanded my world. And for a long time there, I thought I'd never experience joy or happiness again. I really thought I was just going to be living this sad, miserable life. But I can honestly say that I now experience more joy and happiness than I ever did pre-loss. And beautiful. How I try to explain that is that the pain and the loss dug these huge, huge valleys. And for a long time, they were filled with trauma, pain, grief, and loss. But over time, those valleys have now been filled with such joy and peace and happiness and hopefulness. And so, yes, I will always carry the grief. Yes, I will always miss my children. I will be forever waiting for the time when we're all reunited. But until that time, I am just so glad I was given the gift of carrying them at all. And so grateful to God for journeying so closely to us through the dark night of our soul.
Yeah. Oh, Zoe, we haven't had time to talk about all the books you've written, the involvement, being invited by the government into that key role. There's, just so much strategic stuff and the media you're engaged in. I don't want to miss out on any key last thoughts you want to share with us.
Yeah, I'd just say to anyone who is grieving or knows someone who's grieving to just submit to the process. I think especially British people, we've got a very stiff upper lip mantra, and we're not very good at giving grief the space it needs because it is a journey. We always say that you're lucky in England if you get given a 6-month pass to be a grieving person, and then people expect you to go back to the old you. And actually, you'll never go back to the old you. And I think if you ask any bereaved person, they'll say they don't want to. The loss changed them because the love changed them. Yeah. And if we submit to the process, we can actually come through the process so much more wholly and so much more knowing who we are, discovering who God is, and discovering what our faith truly means to us. And it's okay to show up broken. We don't need to just show this perfected image to the world. We can show up crying. And if you want to help a bereaved person, give them that space. Journey with them. Say you can't make it better, and you don't want to take away the pain, because the pain is part of the experience and it's so connected to the love. But what you do want to do is journey with them and just say you just want to hold the tissues, and you'll be there for them. And it's okay however many times they want to share their story, because that's part of the healing. Brains need to keep talking about an experience to process the trauma of it. And so by giving people that permission and saying you can tell your story over and over again and I'll keep showing up and listening, that's such a gift to a bereaved person. But don't give them platitudes. Don't tell them it's just going to get better. Just tell them they're going to, over time, learn to carry this and that you're going to help them by journeying with them. And that's such a gift to a bereaved person. But we can all do our part and sit in that really holy space of grief and just remind them that grief may feel completely hopeless, but hope is always hidden in a back room. And we don't need it to be a cheerleader. We don't need it to be shouting, I'm here, everything's going to be okay. For a time, it needs to sit there in silence, but it will return. And it will return by us giving space to that grieving process.
Well, Zoe Clarke-Coates, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been such an honour to share with you. And I just hope this story helps anybody who's going through something that's life-changing at the moment, because that's what we need to be doing, sharing our stories, because our stories become the light in people's dark rooms. And that's certainly what helped me in my darkest of hours, of knowing other people had gone through this and had survived it. And I needed to know that I would be able to survive it too.
Well, God bless you and Andy and your girls. And I know this is the sort of podcast that will resonate deeply with many. I mean, we had an early miscarriage in Burundi. It was thoroughly unpleasant. I know lots of people close to me who suffered similarly. So, guys, do pass it on to someone who you know it will help and minister to. We'll put stuff in the blurb because there's loads of resources that, Zoe's written 5 best-selling books, and we'll put that in the blurb, and you can be in touch with her and her ministry, Mariposa. Thank you. Give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes, because it just means that the algorithm will get more people to listen to it, and that'll bless and help and encourage more people. I want to thank Adam Thomas Dear for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, we'll be back with a very different story. Every week, it's so different. It's so edifying in different ways, isn't it? I hope you leave encouraged, inspired, challenged, stirred on multiple levels this week. But in the meantime, have a good one, and we'll see you next time. Toodaloo.